That morning, I checked my mailbox, expecting a birthday card from my daughter. Instead, I found a certified letter from a bank I had never used, informing me that my home equity line had been drawn down to its absolute limit, effective 4 days earlier. My son-in-law's signature was on the authorization. My name was on the account, but I hadn't signed a single thing. If you're watching this, tell me where you're tuning in from, and stick around. Because what happened over the next 3 weeks is going to make you furious, and then it's going to make you smile. Let me walk you through exactly how this started. It was a Tuesday morning in early spring, the kind of morning in coastal Georgia, when the fog sits low over the marsh, and the air smells like salt and pine. My name is Walter Pruitt. I'm 68 years old. I spent 34 years as an actuarial risk analyst for a national insurance underwriter, the kind of job where you spend your whole career finding the one flaw in a contract that everybody else missed. I was sitting on my back deck with a mug of chicory coffee, looking out over the water, when I opened that letter. The house had been quiet since my wife Eleanor passed 18 months earlier. Pancreatic cancer. 6 months from diagnosis to the funeral. I had spent those 18 months learning how to be alone in a house built for 2 people, and I had mostly made my peace with it. What I had not made my peace with was the fact that our only child, our daughter Melissa, had married a man named Trent Vance 4 years ago, and that Trent had apparently just helped himself to $210,000 of my equity using a power of attorney I never granted. I read the letter twice. My hands did not shake. I want to be honest with you about that, because I know it sounds strange. I had spent an entire career staring at numbers that represented other people's ruin, calculating the exact moment a policyholder's luck ran out. Panic was never useful in that job. It isn't useful now either. I set the letter down on the patio table, weighted it with my coffee mug so the breeze wouldn't take it, and I walked back inside to call the bank. The woman on the phone was polite but firm. The loan had been originated through a home equity line I had, in fact, opened 3 years earlier for a roof replacement, and never closed. Someone had used a durable power of attorney, notarized, she said, to draw the remaining available credit down to 0. The name on the document was Trent Vance. The notary's stamp was from an office 2 counties over, one I'd never heard of. I hung up the phone, and I sat at my kitchen table for a long moment, looking at the wedding photo of Melissa and Trent that still hung on my hallway wall. Trent had always struck me as a man who smiled with his mouth and calculated with his eyes. He ran what he called a boutique real estate consulting firm, which as far as I could tell mostly consisted of him wearing expensive watches and talking about deals that never seemed to close. Melissa had defended him to me more times than I could count. My daughter, my only child, the girl I taught to change a tire and balance a checkbook, had married a man who apparently thought my house was an ATM. I did not call Melissa first. I want to be honest about that too. 34 years of finding the flaw in the contract had taught me one thing above all else. You do not tip your hand until you understand the entire shape of the fraud. So instead, I called my attorney, a sharp, weathered woman named Corinne Ashby, who had handled Eleanor's estate and who had, on more than one occasion, told me I was too trusting for a man who used to catch other people's lies for a living. "Corinne," I said when she picked up, "I need you to pull every document with my name on it from the last 6 months. Every one." She didn't ask why. She just said give her until end of day. While I waited, I did something Trent had never once considered I was capable of. I drove to the county courthouse myself and requested copies of the notarized power of attorney directly from the recorder's office. It took me 40 minutes and a $12 fee. The document was almost convincing. My signature, forged with real skill, sat above a line that read, "Durable power of attorney granting financial authority to Trent Allen Vance." But I noticed something Trent hadn't planned for. The notary's commission number, printed in small type at the bottom, belonged to an office that, according to the Secretary of State's public database, had been suspended 8 months prior for unrelated violations. Trent had used a dead notary stamp. He had been sloppy, or he had been rushed, and either way, he had just handed me the first nail. I drove home with the copies on the passenger seat, and I called Melissa. She answered on the second ring, cheerful, a little breathless. "Dad, I was just about to call you. Trent and I wanted to invite you to dinner Friday. We have some exciting news." "What kind of news, sweetheart?" "We're finally doing it. We're opening the second location, the Savannah office. Trent's been talking about it for a year. Her voice had the particular brightness of someone repeating a script she'd been handed. It's a big investment, but it's going to change everything for us. I looked at the forged document sitting on my kitchen counter. $210,000. A boutique real estate consulting firm that needed a second location. I understood, in that moment, exactly where my equity had gone. "That's wonderful," I said, and I meant every syllable of the lie. "I'll be there Friday." I hung up the phone and I sat with the quiet of my house, the same quiet that had followed me since Eleanor died, except now it had a different weight to it. It wasn't grief anymore. It was resolve. That evening, Corinne called back. She had found something I hadn't expected. 3 months earlier, I had signed a standard medical directive during a hospital visit for a minor cardiac arrhythmia. Nothing serious, resolved with medication, but Melissa had been the one to drive me to that appointment and sit with me in the waiting room. Corinne believed that visit had given Trent the idea, and possibly the paperwork template, for what came next. He hadn't asked me. He'd built an entire forged instrument off a document I'd signed in good faith for an entirely different, far more limited purpose. "Walter," Corinne said, "this isn't a family misunderstanding. This is elder financial exploitation and forgery. Under Georgia law, that's a felony, and given the dollar amount, it likely rises to a serious one. You need to decide right now whether you want to handle this as a family matter or a legal one, because once I file anything, there's no quiet version of this left." I thought about Eleanor. I thought about the promise I'd made her in the last weeks of her life, when she made me swear I would look after our daughter, that I would never let anyone convince Melissa she wasn't loved. I had kept that promise for 18 months, but keeping a promise to protect my daughter did not mean protecting the man who was actively looting her father while she believed it was a business investment. "Give me 1 week, Corinne," I said. "I want to understand exactly what he's built before we take it apart." Friday came. I drove to their townhouse in Pooler with a bottle of wine I had no intention of drinking and a recording application quietly running in my shirt pocket. The kind you can buy for less than $20. No different from what any concerned citizen might carry. I want to be clear about something. I did not go there to entrap anyone. I went there because a man who forges a power of attorney rarely stops at one lie, and I needed to hear, in his own voice, exactly what he believed he had gotten away with. Dinner was pleasant on the surface. Trent talked at length about the Savannah office, about market positioning and aggressive early growth, using the particular vocabulary of a man who has read business books but never run a real business. Melissa watched him with the soft, hopeful expression of a woman who wanted very badly to believe her husband was finally succeeding at something. After dinner, Melissa excused herself to the kitchen to plate dessert, and Trent leaned back in his chair, loosening his collar, the posture of a man who believes his audience has left the room. "You've been quiet tonight, Walter," he said. "Everything all right?" "Just thinking about the roof," I said. "The one I financed a few years back. Funny thing, the bank tells me the line's maxed out." I watched his face for exactly 1 second too long, and I saw it. Not panic, something closer to mild irritation, the look of a man annoyed that a minor detail had surfaced ahead of schedule. "Yeah, about that," he said, lowering his voice. "I meant to loop you in. It was faster to just handle it through the existing paperwork rather than bother you with new loan applications. You know how banks are. I figured you'd rather I just take care of it." "Take care of it," I repeated. "You've got Eleanor's life insurance sitting in that money market account doing nothing, Walter. No offense, but at your age, sitting on that much idle cash isn't smart. I'm putting it to work. This Savannah office is going to triple in value inside 2 years. You'll thank me." "I didn't sign anything, Trent." He smiled, and it was the smile I'd always distrusted, the one that didn't reach his eyes. "Sure you did. You signed that directive at the hospital. I just had my guy formalize the language a little. It's basically the same thing. Look, Walter, I love Melissa, and I love you as part of this family, but you had a heart scare. Your memory isn't what it used to be. We both know it. I'm protecting the family's assets. That's all this is." I felt something cold and absolute settle over me, the same feeling I used to get in the final minutes before I found the clause that broke an entire fraudulent claim wide open. He had just confessed, on tape, to using a forged legal instrument to strip a man he believed was cognitively declining. He had done it smiling, at his own dinner table, 3 feet from the kitchen where his wife was slicing pie. "You should be thanking me," he added, refilling his wine. "In 5 years, you'll be living off the returns from this office. I'm building something for all of us." I did not raise my voice. I did not confront him at that table. 34 years in risk analysis teaches you that the moment you reveal what you know is the moment your leverage disappears. I smiled, told him it sounded like he had it all figured out, and asked for a second slice of pie. Melissa drove me to my car afterward, hugging me a little longer than usual. "Thank you for coming, Dad. I know Trent can be a lot sometimes, but he really is trying." I told her I loved her, and I drove home in silence, the recording sitting in my pocket like a loaded weapon I had no intention of firing yet. Over the following 10 days, Corinne and I built the case with the patience of two people who had spent their careers waiting for numbers to confess. She confirmed the notary fraud through the Secretary of State's office. I used contacts from my old underwriting firm, men and women who owed me favors from decades of clean audits, to trace the wire transfers from my equity line into an LLC called Coastal Vance Holdings. The Savannah office, as it turned out, did not exist. There was no lease. There was no signage. There was a shell company, a registered agent in Statesboro, and a single business checking account that had received my $210,000 and immediately transferred 60% of it into Trent's personal brokerage account, where it had been used to cover margin calls on options trades that had gone badly wrong months earlier. Trent Vance was not building a business. He was drowning in a hole of his own making, and he had used my forged signature as a bucket. There was a second name on that brokerage account, a joint holder listed as an authorized trader. Not Melissa, a woman named Rachel Kessler, who according to public records worked as a client relations associate at the same brokerage firm. I asked one of my old colleagues to quietly pull whatever public information existed, and what came back turned my stomach. Rachel Kessler and Trent Vance had a shared mailing address for a private mail drop in Pooler, separate from the townhouse where he lived with my daughter. They had opened it 8 months ago, around the same time as that hospital visit, around the same time the forged directive first appeared. I sat with that information for a long night on my back deck, listening to the marsh birds, thinking about my daughter asleep 40 minutes away, next to a man who was not only stealing from her father, but very likely betraying her as well. I felt no triumph in that discovery, only a deep, aching certainty that Melissa deserved to see the whole truth, not a partial one, and that if I moved too early, Trent would simply blame the missing money on a bad investment and let her believe he was merely reckless rather than a liar twice over. Corinne finished drafting the civil complaint and the criminal referral within the week. She wanted to file immediately. I asked her for one more thing first. "Trent's opening a real second office," I told her. "A ribbon cutting." Melissa mentioned it at dinner. "Investors, family, a local news crew for the small business segment. I want to be there." Corinne studied me for a long moment over her glasses. "Walter, that's a public spectacle. Is that really the plan?" "He built his whole life on being watched and admired," I said. "I want the truth delivered in the same room where he's been telling his lies." She didn't argue further. She filed the criminal referral quietly with the district attorney's financial crimes unit that same afternoon, along with the notarized fraud evidence and the wire transfer records, and asked them to hold any public action until the following Saturday, the date of the ribbon cutting. The DA's office, it turned out, had been building a small file on a suspended notary, running a forgery operation out of a UPS store in the next county over. My case, they told Corinne, was the piece that let them finally move. The ribbon cutting was held in a strip mall storefront that had, in fact, been leased 2 weeks earlier, likely with whatever remained of my money after Trent's brokerage losses. A banner reading Vance Coastal Realty Group Grand Opening hung over the door. Melissa stood beside Trent in a new blue dress, glowing with the particular pride of a woman who believed her husband had finally arrived. Rachel Kessler stood near the refreshment table, close enough to Trent that I saw Melissa's eyes flick toward her twice with a small, unplaced unease she hadn't yet let herself name. I arrived in my good gray suit, the one I'd worn to Eleanor's funeral, and I stood near the back of the small crowd of 40 or so guests, local business owners, a reporter from the community paper, a scattering of Trent's golf friends. Trent spotted me and raised his glass in my direction with an easy, generous smile. the smile of a man who believed he had already won. He gave a short speech about vision and family, and building something for the next generation. He thanked Melissa for her endless support. He thanked, with a warm, practiced humility, everyone who believed in this dream, and I watched him glance, just once, toward Rachel Kessler as he said it. When the applause settled and the ribbon was cut, I stepped forward, out of the crowd, and asked if I could say a few words. Trent, ever the showman, waved me up with a magnanimous gesture, clearly assuming I intended to offer a proud father-in-law's toast. I held up my phone instead. Trent has always been generous with his words, I said, my voice steady, carrying easily in the small storefront. So I thought it was only fair to share a few of his own. I pressed play. The recording from that dinner table filled the room, tinny but unmistakable. His voice, warm and confident, explaining that he'd simply formalized the language of my hospital directive, explaining that I wasn't thinking clearly anymore, explaining that he was protecting the family's assets by draining a man he believed was too impaired to notice. The room went silent in the particular way. A room goes silent when 40 people realize, all at once, that they are watching something real. Melissa's face drained of color. Trent's practiced smile locked in place for a full 3 seconds before it cracked entirely. That's out of context, he said, his voice rising. Melissa, that's not what it sounds like. There's more, I said quietly, and I read aloud, from a printed page, the wire transfer dates and amounts, the transfer of $126,000 into his personal brokerage account, the joint authorization on that account under the name Rachel Kessler, and the mail drop the two of them had shared for the last 8 months. Melissa turned to look at Rachel Kessler, standing frozen by the refreshment table, and I watched my daughter's entire understanding of her marriage collapse in real time, the way a building collapses when the load-bearing wall is finally removed. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. Not yet. She simply stared at her husband with an expression of total, silent recalculation. Dad, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, is this true? Every word, I said. I have the notary fraud filing, the forged directive, and the wire records. I filed all of it with the district attorney's financial crimes unit 6 days ago. Trent lunged for my phone, and one of his own golf friends, a man I later learned was a retired sheriff's deputy, stepped between us without a word, more out of instinct than allegiance. 2 unmarked sedans pulled into the strip mall parking lot less than 4 minutes later. I hadn't arranged a raid, only a phone call to Corinne the moment the ribbon was cut, letting her know the confession had been played publicly and the moment had arrived. She, in turn, had simply told the DA's office the evidence was now corroborated in front of a room full of witnesses, several of whom were already filming on their phones. 2 detectives from the financial crimes unit walked in, calm and unhurried, and asked Trent Vance to step outside with them. He did not go quietly. He shouted about lawyers, about family, about how I had always hated him, which was true, though not for reasons that mattered anymore. Melissa stood very still in her blue dress, watching the man she had married led out of his own grand opening in handcuffs, past the banner he'd hung with someone else's stolen money. I did not feel joy in that moment. I felt the particular, exhausted stillness of a man who has finally closed a book he never wanted to open. Melissa moved back into my house the following week, into her old bedroom, which I had never quite finished converting into an office. We didn't talk much those first few nights. Grief has its own timeline, and I had learned that lesson already, at great cost, 18 months earlier. But slowly, over shared coffee on the back deck, she began to talk, about the small warning signs she'd ignored, about the late nights she'd explained away, about the particular loneliness of being married to a man who was always performing for a room instead of speaking honestly to his wife. Trent pled guilty 11 months later to forgery and financial exploitation of an elder person, avoiding a trial only by accepting a 6-year sentence with restitution attached. Rachel Kessler was terminated from her firm and is currently facing her own regulatory inquiry over the brokerage account. Most of the $210,000 was recovered through the restitution order and the liquidation of what remained in that brokerage account, though a portion, we were told, is likely gone for good, lost to the same bad trades that started this whole scheme in the first place. I used part of what was recovered to finally pay off the roof loan that started it all, and the rest, at Melissa's insistence and with Eleanor's memory in both our minds, went towards something better. 6 months ago, we opened a small legal aid fund through the County Senior Center, offering free document review for elderly residents who want a second set of eyes on any paperwork before they sign it. We call it the Eleanor Pruitt Fund. Melissa runs the intake desk 2 mornings a week. I still sit on that back deck most mornings, coffee in hand, watching the fog burn off the marsh. The house is quiet again, but it's a different quiet now, the kind that comes after a storm has finally passed, rather than the kind that comes from something missing. My daughter is down the hall, learning, slowly, that she is allowed to trust her own eyes again. And I have learned, at 68, that a career spent finding the flaw in someone else's contract was never really practice for the job. It was preparation for exactly this. Some debts get paid in dollars. This one got paid in truth, delivered in a room full of witnesses, in a man's own voice, on the same day he thought he'd finally won.